Good evening, everybody. It's Mr. Eschbacher. I'm back, and we're calling this the overtime session. Happy St. Patrick's Day. I've got my little leprechaun James here, and we're going to go over the questions that you gave me. All right. Hopefully you enjoyed what I put together for you. Give me feedback. Tell me the stuff that you like. Tell me what works. Tell me what doesn't work. Hey, Alexa, turn off. Oh, there we go, Alexa. Okay. Had a little Dropkick Murphys, why not, for St. Patty's Day. Gonna be eating my corned beef and cabbage soon. Got our fireside chat going, at least for one more time, because after all, we have been talking about the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt. It's important to remember what those fireside chats were. FDR was charismatic. It was his way to explain what his plans for the Great Depression were. With that being said, let's get to your questions. Okay, Mr. Ash, how can the government just shut down? Alright, a lot of meanings here. If I don't hit the meaning that you intended, please follow up with me, let me know. A couple things here. For one thing, government shutdown is a reality, unfortunately, because of our budget process. It's happened a couple times. It recently happened during the Trump administration. It happened around the turn of the century in the 90s. If a federal budget does not get passed on time, then all non-essential, or what's called discretionary spending, stops. So our soldiers will still be fighting. They won't get paid. Government contractors, people who are selling products to us in the government, don't get paid until it gets resolved. Our national parks shut down. You can't go visit the Statue of Liberty. And it's simply because the President and Congress had, at that point, have not passed a budget. All right, how can Republicans make it happen and not it be a joint decision between the two parties? Again, forgive me, that's one that I'm looking maybe for a little bit more specificity. But typically what happens is whenever there's a government shutdown, both the Democrats and the Republicans do that and blame each other. Because they have to come to an agreement. Remember, for a budget to be passed, it has to be passed by the House of Representatives. Anything involving money has to originate in the House. Then it has to get passed in the Senate, and then the President has to sign it. So typically speaking, when that does happen, both sides will play the blame game. Mr. Ash, how come some of the agencies FDR set up did not get checked by the Supreme Court until they had been in effect for a few years? Alright, that's a great question. Couple things to remember. For one thing, the Supreme Court, this is a great essay term, is often called the court of last resort. You don't petition the Supreme Court. See, in our legal system, we have what is called original jurisdiction. That means it's a court's right to hear a case originally. The Supreme Court has a very limited basis for original jurisdiction, only if it's a matter involving clashes between states, involving another nation, very limited basis. You have to first weave your way through our court system. So in some cases it might take years. Secondly, FDR in his second New Deal, and guys, that was the one thing. I would love it if you guys could just go back and just be clear, look at your bagpipe notes, what the second New Deal was. FDR, at the end of his first term, in the early part of his second term, tried to really start to move the New Deal from relief and some recovery to recovery and a lot of reform. And as he did that, more and more as his New Deal policies, which had been passed earlier, took hold, that's when you see two things happen. One, you see some challenges to, like the AAA and the NRA, move up the judicial system through what's called appellate jurisdiction, appealed up to the Supreme Court. But also, remember, this is the late 1930s, and if we do our historical contextualization, you've got totalitarianism, you've got fascism, and some of the critics of FDR were worried that perhaps he was trying to exceed his authority. Mr. Ash, how did fireside chats affect the political opinions of the common person? Hey, listen, a big part of being the president is being charismatic, or at least being someone who can get his message across. If you look at presidents in recent years, President Obama certainly is a person who, in his speaking style, in his delivery, in the way he presents his message, was very effective. President Trump, some of his controversy comes about how, in the way he delivers his message. best example I can give you in period 9, because I love those period 9 connections. When we get to Ronald Reagan, president from 1981 through 1989, was often called the Great Communicator. Remember, Reagan had been a Hollywood actor. Reagan had a gift for speaking to the American people. So FDR was essentially a salesman. And here's where he's different than Hoover. Hoover, just because of his physical appearance, his kind of, uptight manner, he kind of came across as cold and impersonal. The Democrats created terms like Hoover flags, Hoovervilles, Hoover hotels, Hoover blankets to associate the idea that it's his fault. Hoover actually had once said, "Any man who can't make $1 million by the time he's 40 isn't worth a damn." Whereas FDR speaks in this down-home folksy, hey look, we're doing complicated government stuff, but let me break it down for you kind of way. Again, that's why they're called the fireside chats. It's like some guy in the living room with you. Mr. Ash, did Americans end up trusting the banks and put money in them? Who were some of the opponents of this idea? Alright, the banking industry themselves, it was kind of mixed. Some bankers kind of brushed back against not just the bank holiday, but the increased regulations. One of the New Deal programs that you can go back and look at in AMSCO is called the Glass-Steagall Act. One of the problems associated with the Great Depression. There was no difference between a bank that saved your money and a bank that was an investment bank, which meant I could put my paycheck in a bank and then they could be using the funds they had to mess with the stock market. What the Glass-Steagall Act did was it separated. It said, look, you're either a savings and loan type of bank or you're an investment bank. Did it increase confidence? Yes, and that took time. Never say it completely did. I remember when my wife's grandmother passed away, one of the first things that happened was she and my mother-in-law, honey, where was it? Like the buffet drawer or something in the dining room. There was like a little, metal tin, and there was, it looked like a scene out of, Breaking Bad. There was a whole bunch of cash there. A lot of people generationally never really completely trusted their banks since.
All over the place.
Okay. Mr. Esch, how did the New Deal impact African Americans, both positive and negative? That's a great question, because again, we said before, anytime we have a reference to women, workers, Indians, immigrants, African Americans, we got to hit a home run with that. All right, positive. Eleanor Roosevelt. I got to start with her first. Eleanor Roosevelt did more as First Lady of the United States than a lot of politicians did. And she was relentless. Remember, she had worked in the settlement house movement. She had seen what poverty was like, and she kind of used her marriage. Because remember, the term First Lady is a term. It's not a job title. It has some ceremonial types of stuff, but boy, she would just relentlessly get at FDR. Reference Marian Anderson. I think I spoke about this in our last lecture. The African American opera singer, when the Daughters of the American Revolution would not let her use their concert hall, she resigned from the organization and she told Marian Anderson, "You're going to put that concert on at the Lincoln Memorial." Even FDR in cabinet meetings would sometimes say, "My missus says, my missus says." Negatives. FDR certainly 100% could have done more regarding race. The Democratic Party, one of the most powerful groups in there were the Southern Democrats. In fact, in the 1940s, we end up referring to them as the Dixiecrats. FDR could have done more to speak up against segregation, against lynching. He did not. Even some New Deal programs like the CCC were segregated. Were there gains for African Americans in the New Deal? Yes. Were those gains the same as white workers? Not really. How did rewind that. What laws did the AAA violate to be determined unconstitutional? Okay, I'm going to need you to trust me on this. Sometimes we're not going to go down a rabbit hole. You will never have to know what the AAA did, other than the idea that the fear was the government was getting too involved in the marketplace, that the fear was that some of these laws, which were passed by Congress, were basically shifting and granting power to the president that constitutionally he was not supposed to have. Important thing to remember, when the AAA was declared unconstitutional in Butler versus the U.S., FDR acted, Congress acted, they replaced it with a different program called food stamps. where the government was now buying surplus food from farmers so they could distribute it. Okay? How did stock speculation work? Well, glad you asked that. See, if we had March Madness and I wanted to be a betting man, I could probably get great odds. I don't know, 1,000-to-1 odds on a 16 seed. Hey, Morehead State, Towson State, Southwestern Missouri State. You know, the 16 seeds typically are the ones you need a compass for. Well, the idea is no one expects them to win, which means you can get a high payoff. Stock speculation was you think you have a company that should be valuable, that will become valuable. You know, everyone in the market likes to talk about if you had one of the original shares in the Coca-Cola Corporation, one share from the original offering of Coca-Cola would be worth untold amounts. Can you imagine if you had shares in Amazon going back to when the company was created? That somehow I'm the guy who's got this secret sense and I'm going to identify a company that the guys who invest for a living haven't identified. It's gambling, guys. Speculation can be done on land. In fact, speculation has been the cause of most of the major panics on Wall Street, or at least one of the causes. In the housing market in 2008, these guys came up with this idea called credit default swaps. They were speculating that people couldn't pay off their mortgage. Going back through history, Panic of 1837, 1857 was on land speculation. People trying to buy up as much land as they could, thinking that the value of that land would go up. In 1873, railroad speculation. So speculation is glorified gambling. In this case, speculators are buying stocks. Speculators are also buying that stock on credit, or what we call buying on margin. And if you're putting a lot of money in on something risky, you've got an itchy trigger finger. And it's those speculators now, when all of a sudden the market starts to waver, who panic and bail out and sell. That causes a chain reaction. Remember, once you sell, more people do. What happens to stock prices? Unfortunately, we're seeing that right now. Okay, how did FDR actually convince people to put all their money in the hands of the banks? Same question again. All right, how does the intentional deficit help with GDP, and how did balancing the budget cause a recession? Okay, go back in time. To last week, we talked about GDP. GDP is gross domestic product. It is the barometer to measure how the economy is going. It actually used to be called, at least in FDR's day, GNP, gross national product. But I guess economists needed to write a new book, so they changed it. It's an imaginary number that supposedly values everything produced and purchased in a country in a year. The whole idea of Keynesian economics, deficit spending, pump priming, is the idea that the government is the only entity that has enough power through moving money to affect GDP. And according to Keynesian economics, or deficit spending, yes, you don't want to be in debt under normal circumstances, but sometimes you got to do something kind of icky to get better. I always like to equate it to someone who has a life-threatening condition like cancer. Someone has to go get treated for cancer. They're going to do chemo or radiation therapy, and they are told, look, this is going to be unpleasant. It's going to cause you all kinds of health problems. But the trade-off is do nothing. Well, we can't do that. So behind pump priming and deficit spending is this idea that the government can go into debt because that government spending will then inject money in the economy and help get you out. Now, down the road, the idea is the government can rein in that spending, that because the economy is doing better, that means more tax revenue gets collected. FDR in 1938 tried to balance the federal budget. Realistically speaking, the country wasn't there yet. And when he did that, it created an economic recession. When you combine that with the fact that Congress rejected his court packing plan, it kind of brought about the beginning of the end of the New Deal. It ended. That recession and the court packing fiasco ended the New Deal. Okay? All right. What was the purpose of FDR's brain trust? Get a lot of smart guys in a row. Think about it. When we talked about George Washington in the early parts of the year, Washington said, I got this president gig. No one's ever done it. Let me get a bunch of smart guys together. We'll call them the cabinet. FDR has, quite frankly, a bigger problem. The entire economy's gone down the tank, and I don't have to take office November till March, so let me get a bunch of smart dudes and let's come up with any idea. Remember, anything. And that brain trust cranked out, Ivy League economics professors, economists, get a bunch of smart guys and just come up with ideas. Because doing something, even if it doesn't work, is better than doing nothing. All right, New Deal coalition. This is a big one, guys. When I was looking at your assignments, by the way, really good job. I liked what you guys did. A couple of you, I did ask to add a little bit more, but if you guys can give me that quality of work, we're going to be okay. The New Deal coalition, the idea that the Democratic Party, in terms of who makes it up, gets reshaped, retransformed. It becomes a very diverse party because of who gets helped by the New Deal. You've got urban factory workers. You've got guys who are part of the Democratic political machines in the cities. You've got white Southern farmers. You get this broad network. Eventually, later on, that's going to be joined by African Americans. Okay? Last one. What was the 2008 housing bubble burst? Okay. If your parents let you, there's a movie called The Big Short. The book, The Big Short, is even better. Michael Lewis, the guy who wrote The Blind Side. So basically what happened was, in the 1990s, my heart, he's excited, look at that. In the 1990s and early 2000s, the federal government passed policy that said, look, we're going to make it easier to get federally subsidized mortgages. People are spending beyond their means. When you go to get your mortgage approved, that mortgage company, that bank, they're going to approve you for this much money. Being real, guys. They're saying, oh yeah, we'll approve you for this much of a mortgage. If you do your homework, what you're going to find is, that means you're going to have a mortgage, and if you take that amount, you might have to eat ramen noodles every night at dinner. In the early 2000s, because it was so easy to get a mortgage, more and more people were leveraging themselves. Guys, there were houses in Manlius, $500,000 houses, where people had lawn furniture, the kind you buy outside at Walmart in rooms. And there were some guys on Wall Street who realized that a lot of these mortgages and a lot of these other types of debts were unstable. And they did some speculation. They did speculation that people weren't going to be able to pay off their debts. It was called a credit default swap. This is an overly simplistic thing, but believe me, it's complicated. And so basically, now all of a sudden you get people, hey, these speculators were right. People who couldn't afford to pay off their mortgages. They owed more on their mortgage than what their house was worth. People who now all of a sudden they're falling into foreclosure. Now what's the problem? Well, I borrow money from the bank. I borrow 10 grand. The bank kind of owns me. The bank's going to be all over me. I got a $500,000 mortgage. And a lot of other people do. And a lot of other people do. And they're all borrowing money from your bank. If all of a sudden you get a chain reaction, people can't pay that off, what happens to the banks? The banks collapse. What happens to the larger banks? Those investment banks like Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase. They are the ones that are called, quote, too big to fail. And the federal government had to step in and literally bail out some of these gigantic banks. The best example I can give you is Citibank. The New York Mets opened up in the early 2000s a brand new stadium called Citi Field, C-I-T-I, named after the banking institution. They collapsed. The federal government bailed them out. The federal government literally came in and said, here are the terms. You want our money, you have to do da-da-da-da-da. One of the terms was, no. You're not spending money on stuff like naming it, stadium rates, stuff like that. But we can look at that as a similarity with stock market speculation. Again, when we talk about period 9, anything from 1980 onward, look for connections. That's how we're going to do that, guys. You can then move on to President Obama's response when you had that financial crisis. If you look at some of the programs he passed with Congress, Democratic president, Democratic-controlled Congress, very similar. His economic stimulus program, very similar, at least in intent, to what Franklin Roosevelt did. He had opposition to it, the Tea Party movement, which was a very conservative group of Republicans, similar to the Liberty League. You could even so far as to point out critics of FDR, Father Coughlin. Go to anybody on Fox News or Rush Limbaugh, the radio host. People who are going to criticize him. Wherever you can, find those connections. Guys, I like what you did today. I do still need a couple assignments from some of you. Once I get everyone's assignment turned in, then and only then, I will give you the answers to the AMSCO multiple choice. Until then, happy St. Patty's Day.